Up close, she noticed his sharp features, a strong jawline, piercing gray eyes that seemed to hold storms of their own. He was handsome, in an unpolished sort of way, but his clothes looked worn, his shoes scuffed. He didn't seem like the kind of man who belonged in a place like this. "Thank you," he said softly, his gratitude genuine. Emma nodded and gestured to a booth. "Sit anywhere. Coffee. Please." She poured him a cup and set it in front of him, watching as he warmed his hands around the mug. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. Without asking, she went to the kitchen and put together a plate of leftovers, a slice of pie, some scrambled eggs, a piece of toast. When she placed it in front of him, his eyes widened. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You looked like you could use it," she replied with a shrug, her tone casual, though she felt an odd sense of satisfaction at the way his face softened. He ate in silence, and Emma busied herself with cleaning, trying not to stare. There was something enigmatic about him, a quiet intensity that intrigued her. She found herself wondering who he was, what had brought him here, soaking wet and alone. When he finished, he stood and reached for his wallet. "Let me pay you." "Don't worry about it," Emma interrupted, shaking her head. "Consider it a favor." He hesitated, then offered a small, lopsided smile. "Thank you, Emma," he said, glancing at the name tag pinned to her apron. "Just paying it forward," she replied, though her heart skipped at the way her name sounded on his lips. As he turned to leave, she called after him. "Hey, what's your name?" He paused, the door half open. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, he looked back at her, his gray eyes meeting hers. "James," he said simply. And then he was gone. Over the next few weeks, James became a regular fixture at the diner. He always came in during the late hours, when the place was quiet and Emma had time to talk. He was polite but reserved, never offering much about himself. Still, there was a kindness in his gestures, a way he always left a tip, no matter how small his order, or how he carried on conversations that felt effortless, despite his guarded demeanor. Emma found herself looking forward to his visits, even if she didn't fully understand why. He wasn't like anyone she'd ever met. There was a depth to him, a sense that he'd lived through things she couldn't begin to imagine. One night, as she refilled his coffee, she decided to press him. "So James, what's your story?" He looked up, surprised. "My story? Yeah, you show up here at odd hours, you don't talk about yourself, and you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. I'm curious." James chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You don't hold back, do you?" "Life's too short for small talk," she said with a grin. He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Let's just say I'm figuring some things out. Trying to start over." Emma nodded, sensing he wasn't ready to share more. "Well, if you ever need an unbiased ear, I'm here." "Thanks, Emma," he said softly, and something in his tone made her chest tighten. What Emma didn't know was that James wasn't who he seemed to be. He wasn't a drifter or a man down on his luck. In truth, he was James Whitmore, the heir to one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast. But he'd grown tired of the superficiality of his world, the empty conversations and endless expectations. So he'd walked away, trading his tailored suits for secondhand clothes, his penthouse for a small apartment across town. And then he'd met Emma. From the moment she'd opened the door that rainy night, she'd been different. She didn't care about his name or his money. She saw him not as an asset or a means to an end, but as a person. Her kindness was unassuming, her laughter unforced. She was everything his old life wasn't. And without meaning to, he was falling for her. One evening, after the diner had closed, James lingered longer than usual. He helped Emma stack chairs and wipe tables, their conversation flowing easily. As they worked, she glanced at him and asked, "Do you ever feel like you're meant for something more? Like you're stuck in a life that doesn't fit?" James froze, her words hitting closer to home than she realized. "Yeah," he said after a moment. I do. Emma stopped and looked at him, her expression earnest. Well, whatever you're running from. I hope you find what you're looking for. Her words were simple, but they stayed with James long after he left that night. For the first time in his life, he wondered if what he was looking for wasn't a place or a purpose, but a person. And maybe, just maybe, that person was Emma. Segment 2. The early morning light filtered weakly through the blinds of Emma's apartment, casting long shadows across the walls. She had barely slept. Her thoughts had spun like a carousel, circling back again and again to James's quiet presence, the way his voice softened when he said her name, the mystery he carried like a second skin. She had no idea why he affected her so deeply. It wasn't like her to dwell on someone, especially someone she knew so little about. But there was something about him, something unspoken yet magnetic, that made it impossible to forget. At the diner, the usual crowd trickled in: construction workers grabbing breakfast sandwiches, retirees sipping black coffee and trading harmless gossip. Emma moved through the motions as she always did, refilling mugs, taking orders, her smile automatic. But her mind was elsewhere. The hours passed in a blur, and James didn't come. It wasn't unusual for him to skip a night or two. He wasn't a fixture on the schedule, after all. But his absence felt heavier today, as though the diner itself noticed and sagged under the weight of his missing presence. Emma shook the thought away. She wasn't some lovesick teenager. She barely knew the guy. Still, when her shift ended and she found herself lingering by the door, glancing at the street outside, she couldn't ignore the disappointment curling in her chest. James, meanwhile, was pacing the small, sparsely furnished apartment he'd been renting under an assumed name. The walls were bare, the furniture utilitarian. It was a far cry from the marble floors and designer decor he'd grown up with, but it suited him. It was a place to think, to breathe, to figure out who he was when he wasn't James Whitmore, heir to the Whitmore empire. For the past few weeks, the diner had been his sanctuary, and Emma. She had been an accidental salvation. Her kindness had been unexpected, her curiosity disarming. He hadn't intended to get close to her, hadn't intended to get close to anyone. But she had a way of slipping past his defenses, of making him feel seen in a way no one else ever had. It terrified him as much as it drew him in. And now he was stuck, caught between two worlds. The old one was suffocating but safe, familiar. The new one was uncertain, exhilarating, and fraught with the danger of discovery. If Emma knew who he really was, what he'd walked away from, would she see him the same way? Would she look at him with the same warmth, the same quiet understanding? Or would she see him as everyone else in his old life had: a name, a bank account, a means to an end? He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. He couldn't keep living in limbo. He had to make a choice. The rain started just after sundown, a gentle patter that turned the streets slick and reflective. Emma sat by the window of her apartment, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. She had always loved the rain. It was soothing, a reminder that the world kept moving, no matter what. But tonight, it only amplified the restlessness simmering inside her. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, an incoming text from her best friend, Mia. Mia said, "Hey, you alive over there? Haven't heard from you in days." Emma smiled faintly and typed back. Emma said, "Alive. Tired. Same old." The response came almost immediately. Mia said, "Same old, my ass. Something's up. Spill." Emma hesitated, her thumbs hovering over the keyboard. She hadn't told Mia about James, not because she didn't trust her. Mia was the most loyal person she knew, but because she didn't know what to say. How could she explain a connection that felt so intangible, so fragile, without sounding ridiculous? Emma said, "There's this guy." 3 dots appeared on the screen, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, Mia's reply popped up. Mia said, "Oh, we're going there. Who is he?" Emma said, "His name's James. He comes into the diner sometimes. He's different." Mia said, "Different how?" Emma stared at the screen, searching for words. How could she sum up James in a single text? He wasn't just one thing, he was layers upon layers, each one more enigmatic than the last. Emma said, I don't know. He's just different. Quiet, kind. But there's something he's not telling me. I can feel it. Mia said, mysterious diner guy, huh? Sounds like trouble. Emma laughed softly, despite herself. Mia wasn't wrong. James did feel like trouble, the kind you didn't see coming until it was too late. Mia said, be careful, Em. I know you. You've got a soft heart. Don't let him mess with it. Emma said, I won't. But as she set her phone down, Emma wasn't so sure. Her heart might already be in deeper than she realized. By the time James finally walked into the diner again, 3 nights had passed. Emma was behind the counter, wiping it down when she heard the door chime. She looked up, and there he was, shaking off the rain like a stray dog. For a moment she forgot herself, forgot the customers, the coffee pot in her hand, everything but the sight of him. You're late, she said, the words out before she could stop them. James raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Didn't know I was on a schedule. You're not, she said quickly, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Just. You weren't here the last couple of nights. Had some things to figure out, he said, sliding into his usual booth. But I'm here now. Emma poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. Everything okay? He hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug. I don't know, maybe. She leaned against the counter, studying him. You don't have to tell me, you know, whatever it is, but if you want to. James looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. For a moment, he seemed on the verge of saying something important. But then he shook his head, a rueful smile playing on his lips. You're too good, Emma, he said softly. Too good for someone like me. Her brow furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, he said quickly, but the weight in his tone betrayed him. Just, thanks, for the coffee. For everything. Before she could press him further, the door chimed again, and a group of boisterous college students spilled in, breaking the spell. Emma sighed and moved to take their orders, but her mind stayed on James and the words he hadn't said. That night, as Emma closed the diner, she found an envelope tucked under the salt shaker at James's booth. Her name was scrawled on the front in his messy handwriting. She opened it, her heart pounding. Inside was a note, short and cryptic. I'm sorry. You deserve better than the truth. Her hands shook as she folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Whatever James was running from, it was bigger than she had imagined. And she couldn't shake the feeling that, one way or another, it was going to catch up to him. And bring her along for the ride. The next morning, Emma woke to a dull ache in her chest, a weight she couldn't quite shake off. James's cryptic note was still tucked into the pocket of her jacket, the words etched into her mind as if they had been whispered directly into her dreams. She had read it so many times she could almost see the uneven handwriting every time she closed her eyes. I'm sorry. You deserve better than the truth. What truth? What could be so terrible that he thought she couldn't handle it? The question gnawed at her all through the morning as she made her way to the diner, the sky still gray and overcast from the storm that had cleared overnight. The streets smelled like wet pavement, and the air carried a chill that hinted at the changing season. Emma wasn't sure what she expected when she walked into the diner that day. Maybe she hoped James would be sitting there in his usual booth, ready with one of his half smiles and an apology for disappearing, maybe even an explanation for the note. But the diner was empty save for a few early risers nursing their coffees and the faint hum of the radio playing an old jazz tune in the background. A pang of disappointment hit her, and she busied herself behind the counter, trying to push it away. She wasn't the kind of person to dwell on things she couldn't control. At least that's what she told herself. But there was something about James, his quiet presence, his guarded demeanor that had slipped under her skin in a way she hadn't anticipated. She hated how much space he was taking up in her head, how easily he had unsettled the careful balance of her life with just a few late-night conversations and the lingering mystery of who he really was. Earth to Emma, a voice called, cutting through her thoughts. She looked up to see her coworker, Denise, leaning against the pass-through window with an amused smirk. Denise was older, sharp-tongued but warm beneath her gruff exterior. She had a knack for reading people, and Emma had no doubt that she'd already picked up on her distraction. "You've been wiping that counter for 5 minutes," Denise said, nodding toward the rag in Emma's hand. "It's gonna be so clean you can see through it." Emma glanced down, realizing she'd been scrubbing the same spot over and over. She set the rag aside with a sheepish smile. "Guess I'm a little out of it today." Denise raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, late-night mystery man didn't show up, and now you're all moody about it." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "What? How do you?" "I've worked here for 20 years, honey," Denise cut in, crossing her arms. "I see more in this place than you think. That guy's been coming around a lot lately, and don't think I haven't noticed the way you light up when he does." Emma felt her cheeks flush. "It's not like that." "Sure it's not," Denise said with a knowing grin. "Look, I don't know what's going on with him, but you've got that look, the one that says you're about to go diving headfirst into someone else's mess. Just be careful, okay? Some people are more trouble than they're worth." Emma hesitated, Denise's words striking a chord she didn't want to acknowledge. "What if he's not trouble?" she asked quietly. "What if he just needs someone to believe in him?" Denise's expression softened, her gaze lingering on Emma for a moment before she sighed. "Then I hope he's worth it." Later that evening, as the diner wound down for the night, Emma found herself staring at the door every time it swung open. She hated how much she wanted to see James walk in, hated the way her chest tightened each time it wasn't him. By the time the last customer had left and she was locking up, the ache in her chest had settled into something heavier, a quiet resignation. She stepped outside, the cool night air biting at her skin. The streets were quiet, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. As she turned to head home, a figure emerged from the shadows near the corner of the block. Her breath caught as James stepped into the light, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, his hair damp from the lingering drizzle. "James," she said, her voice a mix of relief and frustration, "where have you been?" He hesitated, his gray eyes searching hers. "I've been trying to figure out how to say goodbye." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Goodbye," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're leaving." "I think I have to," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "Staying here. It's not fair to you." Emma took a step closer, her heart pounding. "You don't get to decide what's fair for me, James. If you're in some kind of trouble, if you need help, just tell me. Let me help you." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You don't understand. My life. It's complicated. I'm not who you think I am." "Then tell me who you are," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "Because the guy I've been talking to these past few weeks, the guy who shows up in the middle of the night, who listens, who cares about people, that feels pretty real to me." For a moment James said nothing, his gaze locked on hers. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "What's this?" she asked, taking it from him. "An explanation," he said. "Or the closest thing I can give you right now." Emma unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words scrawled across it in his familiar handwriting. The more she read, the more her stomach twisted. He told her everything, or at least enough to fill in the blanks. His real name, his family, the wealth and privilege he had walked away from. The weight of expectation that had crushed him, the emptiness that had driven him to abandon it all in search of something real, something meaningful. "You're James Whitmore," she said, her voice shaking as she looked up at him. "As in Whitmore Industries." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. Emma stared at him, the truth settling over her like a heavy blanket. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process this new version of him that felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. "I didn't want you to know," James said softly. "Because I didn't want you to see me the way everyone else does. I didn't want to lose." Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to walk away, to protect herself from the storm she could feel brewing around him. But the other part, the stronger part, refused to let him push her out. "You're an idiot," she said finally, her voice breaking. "If you think this changes how I see you, then you don't know me at all." James stared at her, a flicker of hope breaking through the storm in his eyes. "Emma." "Don't," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Don't apologize, don't run. Just stay. Let me decide what's fair for me." For a long moment they stood there in the quiet of the night, the distance between them shrinking with every heartbeat. And for the first time James felt like he wasn't running, not from his past, not from himself, and not from the one person who made him feel like he might finally belong. "Okay," he said at last, his voice barely audible. "I'll stay." And in that moment, Emma knew that whatever came next, whatever truths, challenges, or complications lay ahead, they would face it together. The next day, James didn't show up at the diner. Emma had tried to prepare herself for this possibility, tried to convince herself that he might need time to process, time to breathe. After his confession the night before, she'd seen the weight in his eyes, the way those truths had cost him something every time he'd spoken them out loud. And yet, even as she scrubbed counters and refilled coffee cups, her stomach churned with worry. What if he'd changed his mind? What if staying with her had felt like too much? She worked her shift in a haze, her mind distracted, her movements automatic. Denise noticed, of course. She always did. But this time she didn't tease. Instead, she placed a steadying hand on Emma's shoulder as the younger woman poured yet another cup of coffee for a customer who hadn't asked for a refill. "Honey," Denise said softly, her concern evident in her voice. "Why don't you go take 10? Clear your head." Emma started to protest, but Denise cut her off with a look that brooked no argument. "Go. I'll cover the counter. You look like you're about to unravel." Reluctantly, Emma nodded, stripping off her apron and slipping out the back door into the alley behind the diner. The crisp autumn air greeted her, sharp and cool against her skin. She leaned against the brick wall, closing her eyes and letting the quiet seep into her bones. She thought of James's face, his voice, the way he'd looked at her as he said, "I'll stay." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that whatever fear or uncertainty had driven him to leave his old life behind wouldn't drive him away from her, too. But the truth was, she didn't know. And that terrified her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jarring her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, her heart leaping when she saw his name on the screen. "James, I owe you an explanation. Can you meet me tonight? Your place?" She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A rush of relief flooded her, mingled with a fresh wave of apprehension. What more could he possibly have to say? And why did it feel like the ground beneath her feet was shifting with every word? "Emma, I'll be there. 8 o'clock. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then slipped her phone back into her pocket and headed back inside. Whatever this was, whatever they were, it wasn't over yet. By the time the clock struck 8, Emma's nerves were frayed. She'd spent the afternoon cleaning her apartment, rearranging throw pillows and wiping down surfaces that didn't actually need wiping. She wasn't sure why James had already seen her tiny, modest space plenty of times, but the act of keeping busy had helped distract her from the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. When the knock finally came, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the room and opened the door. James stood on the threshold, his dark coat damp from the light drizzle outside. His expression was guarded, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't quite place. He looked tired, as though he hadn't slept since the last time she'd seen him. But when his gaze met hers, there was a flicker of warmth there, a quiet relief that mirrored her own. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold, his presence filling the small space. He shrugged out of his coat, draping it over the back of a chair, and stood there, his hands stuffed into his pockets, as though unsure of what to do next. Emma gestured toward the couch. "Sit. Do you want something to drink? Tea? Coffee?" James shook his head. "I'm good." He sat down, his posture stiff, like a man bracing himself for impact. Emma took the armchair across from him, folding her hands in her lap as she waited for him to speak. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then James let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I know I keep saying you deserve the truth," he began, his voice low and measured. "And I meant it. But the thing is, Emma, the truth isn't just about who I am